Henry Foy, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
The big, of course, the big piece of news in the most recent days, historical, a new pope.
An American pope, the first. You know, Donald Trump is obviously going to position this as a great win for him, a diplomatic victory for the Americans. I'm not sure it's the kind of pope he would have chosen, given some of the views that the new pope has, but certainly Donald Trump's going to look to maximize the propaganda value, I would assume.
It's interesting that you answer that way, because it might be indicative of the general thinking of the American administration. Only recently it was 100 days since Donald Trump once again became president. I'm curious, what is the thinking about that administration in Brussels, in your city?
I think the EU is they expected a lot of what's happened. They just didn't expect the speed and the force that Donald Trump has brought in his second term. He's obviously a man in a hurry. He's not afraid to break things. He's had a long time to prepare for this, and he's got a team of people around him who are much more committed to the agenda than perhaps he had in his first term. So Brussels is struggling to now keep up. They knew there was going to be an issue on trade, they knew there was going to be an issue on defense spending, and they knew there was going to be some kind of issue over Ukraine. It's all happened much, much faster than Brussels officials thought. And so they're having to scramble to kind of keep up. I mean, a lot of this, I think, will get worked out, but at the moment, Trump is ahead of the curve as the EU tries to find the best response.
They're struggling because of the speed, or also because he was perhaps prepared, whereas they were not? I
think there's an issue here. People always said, you know, take Trump seriously, but not literally. He is now serious and literal. You know, yes, fine, the second half of the 20% tariffs are on pause at the moment, but 20% on EU exports to America is way higher than most people expected. Ahead of him coming in to power, people thought there would be some kind of trade war, but not on this scale. So, yeah, I mean, he is moving a lot faster than people thought, and he's got people around him who are really, really committed to the agenda.
The biggest struggle is with which issue, in your opinion? When you talk to your sources, when you talk to politicians, they see most trouble by what?
I think actually the big problem is they're all coming at once, and Donald Trump is a guy who's going to want one great big grand bargain. This is not what the Europeans want to do. They don't want to put defense spending and NATO protection and US security guarantees and a peace deal in Ukraine and a trade war all in one big basket. That's not how they want to do this. They want the European Commission to handle trade, they want NATO to talk about defense spending, and they want a coalition of the willing on Ukraine. And people are getting very nervous that Trump could start to conflate these issues and start to use them and say, well, if you're not going to spend enough on defense, then we're not going to give you a good trade deal. And if you respond to us with retaliation on trade, which of course the Europeans would be totally in their right to do, and to go tit for tat with Trump, he might say, well, fine, I'm going to pull security guarantees to Europe. I'm going to reduce US troops based in the continent. I mean, this is something that really does worry people in Brussels, that if he starts to conflate these issues, if he starts to try and play countries off against each other by using different elements of his agenda, we could be in big trouble.
How is the situation with the peace negotiations viewed in Brussels? Donald Trump promised that he would do that very quickly. Let's not quote how quickly he promised he would do it, but it was supposed to be like immediately. That has not happened. 100 days have passed, still no deal. There were times when Trump even suggested he would pull out of these negotiations. How is that being viewed in Brussels by the leaders of the EU countries and also the powers that be in the capital of the EU?
I mean, look, nobody really thought he would end this in 24 hours, right? They assumed what he meant there was he's going to do it as quickly as possible, exactly. There's a real kind of nervousness in Brussels that Trump could walk away at any point, but also he could flip 180 and decide he's going to be tough on Russia. It's more the uncertainty that's worrying people. You know, Trump is a pretty enigmatic figure. We know that he can be, he's prone to quick judgments. He likes to fire off messages on social media rather than give long planned speeches. So there's this nervousness in Brussels around what do we do if he does put something on the table that we weren't expecting. I would say in the last few weeks there's been a rise in positivity and optimism amongst EU capitals, certainly the big defense players, that maybe Trump is starting to get the message that Vladimir Putin of Russia is the problem here. He's the man that's carrying on the war. He's the man that's carrying on the killing. And I think you'll see in the next few days even more pressure from European leaders to say, we want a 30-day ceasefire. President Trump, you also want a 30-day ceasefire, let's put this together to Putin, and then if he doesn't accept it, we know that he's the bad guy here. But at the same time, Trump could well say, well, look, the benefits of economic collaboration for Russia and the US are greater, in my view, in Trump's view, than the need to drag this on longer. And so fine, we have a peace deal now. These are my terms, Zelensky. If you don't accept them, we're walking away. So a lot of nervousness that we can't read Trump. We're not totally sure what's going on in his head. There are people around him as well who'll be more hawkish, more dovish, more pro-Ukraine, more pro-Russia. And people are trying to work out what exactly this guy wants and how quickly he wants it.
So if I understand you correctly, there's no one in Europe who we could call a Trump whisperer, someone who knows how to speak to him, how to get to him?
I mean, the whole concept of the Trump whisperer is a long one. There's been a lot of candidates. At the end of the day, this is a man who's prone to short-term decision-making, and I think a lot of the people in his cabinet can consider themselves Trump whisperers, so it's very unlikely that somebody in Europe could do the same. There are some that have proved better than others in terms of trying to move him. I think that the UK-US trade deal, of course, that's just been announced, Sir Keir Starmer, their Prime Minister of the UK, has shown he's obviously got a few skills needed to whisper to Trump. Others have struggled, but I don't think you could say there's somebody in Europe who's able to go there and convince him of something. This is not a man who takes convincing.
Giorgia Meloni seemed to be someone he likes, but as you say, probably there's not one single person who knows how to reach him, right?
And look, the big issues for Trump are, certainly when it comes to Europe, are the trade issue and the defense spending issue, and they are collective decisions at the end of the day. You know, the European Commission handles trade. We know that Trump doesn't like the EU very much, but what I've been quite impressed by is that when Giorgia Meloni, when Emmanuel Macron of France, when Alexander Stubb of Finland go, they're not going to say, please give us a good deal on trade for Italy, for France, for Finland. They're saying, you've got to talk to the Commission. We don't like tariffs. We don't like trade wars. Let's find a deal. Ultimately, though, it is up to the Commission to go and handle that. And it remains to be seen just how open Trump's going to be to that negotiation.
How is that shift in the American thinking of their participation in protecting Europe? That shift is viewed as a negotiation tactic or something that must be treated deadly seriously?
It's definitely the latter. I don't think anyone believes anymore that Trump is calling the Europeans bluff here. I think it's quite clear that, well, at least Trump is saying he's not going to pull the US out of NATO anymore. This was a threat made in 2018 that has now sort of eased, but what he is saying is, I am going to reduce America's footprint here. Most sensible, smart military, defense, foreign policy guys are saying we need to do this, and we probably should have done this 10, 20, 30 years ago. Trump is not the first US president to say it. It remains to be seen how quickly that process is going to go, how soon are troops going to start leaving, equipment's going to start leaving, potential capabilities that could be shifted to Asia. And the European pitch at the moment, as I understand it from what officials are telling me, is at the Hague summit, the leaders' NATO summit next month, the pitch will be, look, we're going to spend a lot more, the Europeans, and Trump's going to say that's great, but we need from you, America, a timetable, a slow and steady shift from you to us in certain areas, because what we don't want is a knee-jerk reaction where Trump unexpectedly pulls out this and that from this country or that country, and Europe is then left exposed. So I think Europe is willing to take on more responsibility. It's willing to spend more money to do it, but it needs to agree a plan with Trump, a transition, if you like.
So phasing out instead of cold turkey.
Well, exactly. And so ultimately phasing out America as Europe phases in, because otherwise you leave gaps that Russia and other adversaries can exploit. And it's really clear this is not a phasing out to zero. It's a phasing out of America down to a more equal relationship. And there'll be certain areas, and the nuclear deterrent is obviously the most obvious one, where Europe can't just step in straight away. It's going to take time. And people are talking 5 to 10 years. Maybe it's going to be longer in other areas.
The question is how we should, because you are most certainly correct that some countries should have done this earlier. There perhaps should have been better decisions, more courageous earlier. Now Europe is trying to play catch up. On the other hand, Putin, while isolated, does seem to have some fans or even friends in Europe.
I mean, obviously, Robert Fico, Prime Minister of Slovakia, was in Moscow this week for the May 9th celebration. Also, the President of Serbia, Vučić. I think he believes he has friends in Europe, but I think also you can look to certain areas where Slovakia is in line with EU policy. It's more complicated to understand exactly what Fico is playing at. Viktor Orban of Hungary is much more overt about his support for Putin, and also, I think more importantly for Europe, it's his dislike of Ukraine. I mean, that's something that really is a problem for the rest of Europe. However, both those men, both those leaders do want peace in Ukraine as well. I mean, their energy supplies, or at least the cost of their energy supplies, depend on it. So I think you're starting to see European unity come around to peace, and pushing this 30-day ceasefire is a great example of that. I don't think you're going to see EU unity on Ukraine completely shatter, and I think people are sort of baking in the amount of trouble that Orban can cause, and they've found a way to limit it.
On the other hand, there's also this question, apart from the leaders like Fico and Orban, of certain populist movements which do seem to be at least sympathetic to Russia, and they seem to be increasing in popularity and significance in Germany, in France, perhaps a bit in Italy. How big of a challenge will that be for a united European response and reaction to what Russia is doing in Ukraine?
Well, look, I think if those movements were to come into power in Germany, in France, in other countries, there would be a huge problem. So really the question is, will they reach power? I think you have seen them rise in popularity over the last decade or so, and I think European Union is rightly concerned about that. But until they get to power, we don't want to panic. And I think there are ways in which anti-disinformation campaigns, I should say, have actually been quite successful. And one thing I would say is that not to give Putin too much credit for some of these movements. Like, yes, some of them are pro-Russian, but it's not always the main element of that popularity is pro-Russian. And so there are other ways that these parties can see their popularity reduced by economic success in those countries, by different migration policies being operated that would then reduce the popularity of these extremist parties. So I think there are a lot more things that liberal centrist movements can do, and it's not always right to sort of throw your hands up in the air and panic and say this is a foregone conclusion. Of course, the French election, presidential election, will be critical, and let's see whether the success of the new government in Germany is successful in reducing the popularity of the Alternative for Deutschland.
I want to ask about the German one in a moment, but as I was listening to you, I thought I recalled that also these extremists seem to have some very influential friends. Like, for example, Marco Rubio, the top diplomat in the United States, he uploaded a tweet in which there was some anger towards the AfD being labeled an extremist party, something that should perhaps be legalized. You have Elon Musk, who also tends to support them. And that seems like support that is very difficult to counter in Europe.
Look, I was at the Munich Security Conference when Vice President J.D. Vance gave his speech. It was incredibly aggressive towards Europeans, and essentially was saying, why should we defend you as America if you don't hold the same values that we do on democracy and freedom of speech? I think in some of these areas, with Vance defending the AfD, with Musk getting involved in extremist parties in Europe, it's much more of a domestic US message about freedom of speech that the Republican Party and Trump in particular is trying to push, and Europe is something of a sort of a battleground for those voices.
A proxy war, perhaps, right?
Yeah, I mean, when Marco Rubio is tweeting or J.D. Vance is giving a speech in Munich, they're primarily thinking of U.S. voters. They're not really thinking that European voters are going to listen to them and think, oh, I've got to vote for the AfD because Marco Rubio thinks so. And actually, I've been quite surprised and actually quite pleased to see that when these American officials have tried to get involved in European politics, it hasn't always worked. The AfD's numbers did not go up very much after Elon Musk got involved, and it remains to be seen whether they will now with Marco Rubio. Obviously, the Trump agenda is free speech, freedom of speech, everyone should be able to vote for who they want for. But it's interesting how they apply that themselves, and some of the crackdowns we've seen in America against journalists, against people protesting on university college campuses. So sometimes their actions and their words don't always match up.
Questioning what the courts did in Romania while they themselves went to court in 2020. You mentioned what's going on in Germany. There's a new government. And how difficult of a predicament is Friedrich Merz, especially in the context of the rise of popularity of AfD?
Look, AfD is obviously much more popular now than it was a decade ago, but I actually think there's quite a lot of stability in the grand coalition that we now have in Germany. I think Merz is right to try to focus on what he can do rather than worrying about what the AfD might do in opposition. And I think I've been quite impressed by the way Merz has begun his now short chancellorship. Obviously, he's only been in power for a few days, but he's been chancellor in waiting for much longer than that. Look, Germany, like it or loathe it, as Germany goes, Europe ultimately will follow. It's been amazing to see the meetings between Merz and Prime Minister Tusk, Macron and Tusk, Merz and Macron, with Sir Keir Starmer in the UK. There is this definite coalition and coalescing around the sort of big powers, the big serious European defence and security powers with the economies to match. That, for me, is a sign of Merz understanding his role, understanding Germany's really quite a critical role at the moment, and I think making up for lost time. I think most people would agree, perhaps even Scholz himself would agree, that the chancellorship of Olaf Scholz was not as impactful as it should have been, and really was not as impactful as the rest of Europe hoped it would be. The fiscal space that Germany has unspent compared to other countries is vast. And ultimately, if Germany does start spending more money on defence, does start spending more money on infrastructure, does find a way to get its economy growing again in a really serious way, that will have huge impacts on Europe. And ultimately, you know, we talk about the importance of NATO countries rising their defence spending by 2-3% in some cases on average. For the smaller countries, that's great for them, it's great for their numbers, but ultimately, if Germany goes big, that makes a much bigger difference than a dozen or so countries doing the same. My
final question is about the Polish presidential election, which is just a few days away, just slightly more than a week. Is that watched closely with heightened attention in Brussels, or is it just another election?
It's absolutely watched with close attention. The return of Donald Tusk as Prime Minister was a moment I think the EU took a sigh of relief. Certainly a lot of centrist powers in the EU were happy to see Tusk come back. I think while they of course would not get involved in a domestic sovereign election, they would also be sort of quite happy to see Trzaskowski elected as president. I think there are concerns about how policy making going forward would look like in Poland if you had a president and a prime minister that didn't get on, didn't look to cooperate. And you only have to look around the region and see, as we've said, Prime Minister Orban, Prime Minister Fico, Andrej Babiš is doing rather well in the polls. You have an election in Romania where ultimately the likely winner, I think we can say based on the first round, is a more extremist candidate. Brussels is looking to Poland as a linchpin of stability, as a linchpin of security in this part of Europe. And so, yeah, people are watching the election and hoping that what comes out is a system between government and president that will be productive, that will look to implement the best policies for the EU at large, and also get things done. I mean, this is not a time for policy making to grind to a halt.
Henry Foy, it's always an absolute delight to have you on our show. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.